This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm your host, Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest is scientist and energy policy researcher Joseph Rand of the Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, or Berkeley Lab. Joe has done research and analysis on energy policy, cost, and markets for nearly a decade, and he led the work on Berkeley Lab's just released update on the generation awaiting interconnection by U.S. transmission system operators. In this USEA podcast, we're going to talk about Berkeley Lab's update, which shows the 1,570 gigawatts of proposed generation waiting to be connected is more than the total estimated 1,280 gigawatts of existing U.S. generation. Joe's going to talk about the backlog, and he's going to talk about why there may be some promise of resolving this wait list in changes imposed by the 2023 Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, Order 2023. Joe, the good news is the enormous supply of zero carbon generation waiting in what are called interconnection queues. Nearly 12,000 projects, with almost 95% of them, 1,480 gigawatts of it in solar, wind, and 1,030 gigawatts of storage, and only 79 gigawatts of natural gas. But the bad news is that the amount of clean energy stuck in these interconnection queues is growing. Can you tell us a little more of what the report found about the queues?
Yeah, thanks, Herman. And you gave us a really good introduction there, kind of covering that this is a two-sided story. There's kind of the optimistic take on it, where we see all this developer interest in, building and developing new, mostly clean energy resources. And then the flip side of that coin is just seeing, a lot of these projects just getting stuck and kind of languishing in this process. So just to kind of give a quick overview on what we're finding, as you said, in total, almost 2,600 gigawatts or 2.6 terawatts of generation and storage now actively seeking grid connection across the United States. So that 2,600 is more than twice the total installed capacity of all of the power plants that we have currently installed in the United States.
Amazing.
Again, yeah, like you talked about, 95% of that is solar, storage, and wind. I mean, really what we're seeing here in terms of what developers are submitting, these requests that developers are submitting to connect to the grid, represent just a fundamental transformation of our electric system. And so if we want to talk about the energy transition and kind of near-term or medium-term trends, the signs and the tea leaves are all right here in these interconnection queues. But then, of course, there's the flip side that you mentioned as well, where we see, I'll get to the wait times and the delays in a second, but first and foremost, just a lot of these projects will never really see the light of day. So they're kind of requests and initial ideas or proposals that developers are submitting. But ultimately, what we found is historically just about 20% of those proposed projects actually end up going and reaching commercial operations or being built and coming online and actually providing power. And over 70%, when we looked historically, have withdrawn their applications. So a lot of these projects end up, like I said, kind of languishing and then dropping out for one reason or another. We can talk about that a little more in a minute here. But the other thing we're seeing in addition to these kind of low completion rates is that it's just taking longer and longer to get through this process. So we look at this in a couple of different ways, but I would say the simplest way to think about it is from when the developer submits that request to connect to the grid, how long does it take from the day that request is sent in until the day that project is built and providing power? And if you were to look, maybe back in the mid to late 2000s, you might take two years to complete that process. Then in the mid 2010s, around 2015, our data show that process might have taken about 3 years. So increasing a little bit, but maybe still reasonable from a development perspective. The median project that we saw coming online in 2023, just this past year, took about 5 years to complete that.
Wow.
that process. So it's taking
Wow.
longer. And that 5-year timeline, I think, is problematic when we think about a number of goals that we want to achieve, not just decarbonizing our electric sector, but maintaining reliability and economic efficiency of our system. Uh,
Right. Well, Joe, it seems like the bad news is, in fact, getting worse. And a big part of the problem from what I got from from reading your report is that the studies by system operators and utilities on upgrades that are needed to interconnect each new project, they get complicated, they take a long time, people question the costs, which is why, as you said, barely 20% of projects get through and so many are withdrawn. Can you walk us through the study process, little places the complications are, and tell us why it's so slow and inefficient?
Absolutely. No, let me start by saying that a lot of the data we're studying and a lot of these requests and these proposed projects are kind of going through a process that I would say is out of date and has been reformed. Now, we'll
Mm,
get to these reforms from FERC in a moment, but I should really be clear that, you know, the reforms from FERC that just were kind of enacted last year haven't fully been implemented yet. So all of the data we're looking at are still in this process that actually was designed by FERC in 2003. So look
wow.
back 20 years ago, and you know the electric system and our whole electric market was in a very different place than it is today. So suffice it to say, how does this process work? Basically, a developer is going to submit their interconnection request to the transmission provider. And then the transmission provider or the utility is going to run these series of studies, and those studies are designed to kind of understand and assess the impact of that new generation or storage plant on the grid system, and also figure out, hey, what upgrades would be required if we put this power plant here? What transmission system upgrades are going to be required at the point of interconnection, like the substation, and also on the transmission network to make sure that this is going to be safe and the system is going to be reliable. Now, the studies also, and you alluded to this a little bit, the studies also look at what is the cost of those upgrades to upgrade the grid and connect the new generation. And this is where it starts to get sticky because in most places across the US, most transmission systems and transmission providers, the developers just don't have a way to get a good sense of that cost before they enter the interconnection queue and submit this request, right? So I think
Mm,
what we're seeing to some degree is developers are, they're thinking about, hey, we want to build a project or we want to build several projects. We're thinking about this area or this area, but they don't know what the cost to interconnect is going to be until they submit that request. So I think part of why this process has gotten bogged down is we're seeing both this explosion of interest, of developer interest, surging demand for clean energy, both supply and demand, really. But we're also at the same time, constrained in this paradigm where they have to submit these requests and go through these studies that take a long time and require a lot of careful engineering and models in order to understand the true cost of those developments. So that you can imagine that gets complicated in large part, if you are a developer and then you find out, oh my gosh, this is going to cost millions and millions of dollars in grid upgrades if I put my project here. It's no longer economically viable for me to connect right here, so I'm going to withdraw that application. Now, in some ways, maybe withdrawing, you can just move on and shift to the next one. But I think this, like I talked about, the kind of outdated process that we have been under. And part of the problem is that sometimes, in some cases, or many cases, those withdrawn projects could end up causing kind of cascading problems to other projects that remain in the queue. And then they would be
everything has to be reevaluated
evaluated.
because now there's one less project, and so that all the other projects impacts might be different, right?
Exactly. So let me just say one more thing there. So there's that was, leading to inefficiencies and what we call cascading restudies and lengthening delays. But at the same time, while I talk about this fundamental energy transformation and the surging demand and surging requests and interest in developing clean power and just the volume of wind, solar, and storage that we're seeing entering the queues has not been met on the other side with an increase in transmission build transmission expansion, upgrading, maintenance, and planning. So I think if we are, I can't talk about this kind of process and the inefficiencies without also noting that we just cannot possibly connect all this new generation and storage, and we can't achieve the energy transition without proactively planning and building and expanding our transmission network.
Yeah, it's almost like studying 19th century philosophy. One complicated question intertwines with another complicated question, but let's not go there. FERC Order 2023 established some important new requirements for the studies. And the system operators have to now do things like, or have to propose ways of doing things like cluster studies, setting project readiness criteria, imposing financial penalties for delays. Uh, are there things here? Can you point to a few of the things in this study process that FERC Order 2023 looks like it may really sort out and help streamline?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of the big ones already. I'll touch on them again just to explain what we mean, like with cluster studies and first ready, first served. This old paradigm that I talked about, that was the kind of interconnection procedures under FERC Order 2003, which again, that's that 20-year-old process. That was more of what we call a serial process where you just get in line one by one, and it was first come, first served. So again, as you can imagine, it's just like any other line, like a line at the grocery store.
Mm.
If a project is, not really ready to go, let's say it doesn't have an offtake agreement or power purchase agreement, or they don't have site control, so they couldn't possibly move forward with that project, but it's still in line ahead of you. They're going to get studied first. If they withdraw because their costs are high, that's going to cause problems to you, like I mentioned earlier. So this idea of cluster studies and first ready, first served, again, just really flips that paradigm where instead of one by one, they're able to put the requests, the proposed projects together in a batch, or what they call a cluster, and study a bunch of them together at once. And then this idea of first ready, first served, again, advances those projects that are demonstrating readiness criteria. And like I said, one, readiness criteria might be site control, where you can prove and demonstrate, if I'm going to build a 100 megawatt solar project, I've got my leases, or I've bought some land and I have some landowner lease agreements in place. Maybe I have a local siting agreement in place. Things like that can really demonstrate that your project is ready to advance. You talked a little bit about financial penalties, and what I like about what they did with Order 2023 is it requires all the stakeholders to step up their game. So not only do developers have to do a little bit more in terms of that readiness criteria that I talked about, but also the transmission providers and the ISOs have to do a little bit more. So their feet are held to the fire with these financial penalties if they're not conducting their studies and completing these studies quickly enough in the allotted time that FERC gives them. Then those transmission providers face penalties. So again, both sides have to step up their game. And the last thing I'll say, there's a lot more in Order 2023. I think it's like 1,400 pages. It's a
Wow.
lot to get through, but there's some other interesting things. One item that I mentioned earlier is this idea that developers just don't have a way to get a sense of the cost ahead of time when they're thinking about where to build or siting their proposed projects. There's a little bit in Order 2023 that aims to get at that. So they're requiring transmission providers and ISOs to produce what basically we're calling them heat maps. That would be a graphical, map illustration of transmission capacity on these systems. So essentially how much headroom is available to connect a new power plant, and potentially what's the estimated cost. Now, those aren't going to be perfect, and they won't replace these engineering and power flow studies that are actually conducted in the interconnection process, but they might send a little bit of a signal to give developers just that little bit of data and pre-screening that might help this process a little bit.
Okay. Joe, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to talk about one other aspect of this. There's 7 regional and independent system operators, and they manage about 60% of U.S. electricity supply. And they have begun to address Order 2023. In other words, the FERC can order it, but it's up to these seven operators to implement it. And those are called compliance plans. Uh, and I know that the California system is developing some really interesting compliance plans. Can you tell us about which ones might stand out from MISO in the Midwest, from PJM with the Atlantic states, and with ERCOT in Texas, for instance? What are the things that they're actually planning to implement that
Yeah.
will solve this?
This is a great question, Herman, and I'm really glad you brought it up because I kind of glossed over this earlier talking about that 20-year-old process. In fact, the ISOs, or independent system operators, or regional transmission organizations, these seven markets that you talked about. And actually, I should be clear that ERCOT in Texas is not FERC jurisdictional, so they're doing their own thing. We'll talk
Oh,
about
yeah.
it later. But let's say the six that are FERC jurisdictional. Now they have the ability to apply for what's called a variance with FERC, and they can establish new procedures for how they operate this sort of thing. So the interconnection processes that we see in the ISOs can look a little different than it looks in all the non-ISO utility or balancing areas. So what I'm getting at is that over these intervening 20 years, actually, a lot of these ISOs, like the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, California, SPP, Southwest Power Pool, a lot of them have actually, over the years, already implemented a series of reforms. So for example, MISO has been doing cluster studies for over a decade. Now, we talked about how that's innovative in Order 2023. What Order 2023 does is really brings everyone up to that level, all the non-ISOs. So I guess what I'm getting at is, some of this stuff was already underway before Order 2023 came around. And I think in the case of, let's say, PJM, who just implemented some major reforms around 2022, I think they were really seeing the writing on the wall. First of all, they were seeing their process get bogged down. And, like I said, these projects were taking longer and longer. They were getting more volume of requests than they could handle. And they said, we need to make a change. Moreover, they could see that FERC was kind of making moves toward reform. So they, again, requested this variance back in 2022 before Order 2023 from FERC came around. So let me just talk about what some of those interesting things are that the ISOs have been doing. MISO, for example, has been talking about increased milestone payments, increased penalties for withdrawing, and increasing site control requirements to, again, demonstrate that readiness. And those
Right.
higher withdrawal penalties, especially as you advance later and later in the process, just encourage developers to kind of do things more proactively and be careful. And some of those were already approved. Now, MISO also requested from FERC to have a cap on the total queue size. So they said, we don't want our queue to get over, I don't know what that number was, but X number of gigawatts. And FERC actually rejected that. So there are some things where the ISOs are trying different things and proposing new ideas, and FERC is accepting some of them and rejecting others. Now, the last thing I'll say is that, again, a lot of the ISOs are implementing and proposing these different reforms. But everybody, all the ISOs and all the non-ISO utilities have to comply with FERC Order 2023 or submit those compliance filings within the next 30 days. We're finally at that point where that's been really vetted and finalized by FERC. And so it would be interesting to see those trickling in. And I have to say, I'm excited to take a look at this report when we compile the data next year and see if anything's
Yeah.
but it is what I'll say about Order 2023, and I'm quoting one of the FERC commissioners, Commissioner Clements, said, it raises the floor for everybody, but it's not the ceiling. So what I'll say with that is, there's more that can and maybe should be done. I'll just put in a plug for the Department of Energy's Interconnection Innovation Exchange, or I2X program. We just released this transmission interconnection roadmap with 35 innovative solutions that really complement and build upon FERC Order 2023. So more could be done to really improve this whole process, but it's good to see that floor elevating with Order 2023.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe. That's all the time we have. I got to thank my guest, scientist and energy policy researcher Joseph Rand of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, for describing the challenges facing the 1,570 gigawatts of proposed generation, 95% of which is clean energy, waiting to be connected to the U.S. transmission systems, and why new practices might resolve the backlog. And as Joe pointed out there at the end, why some other new practices that are still in the offing are coming from the Department of Energy that could even take us further and faster. Which is why, by the way, we don't call it an energy left turn, we call it an energy transition. So, as always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.